thank you for joining us here at the Kansas City Public Library for tonight's event. We are having some minor technical difficulties, so we will be getting
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Plaza Library, part of the Kansas City Public Library System. I hope that you are all ready for a really wonderful evening. My name is Julie Robinson, and I am, you ready for this? The Refugee and Immigrant Services and Empowerment Outreach Manager for the Kansas City Public Library. It's about that long. Thank you. Took me a long time to actually get it in the right order. So I get to tell you what I do. Now, I'm going to give you the really short version because I could stand up here for hours and then you wouldn't get to the person you're here to see. So we started RISE 10 years ago, and I had 2 mandates from the president of the library board and from the library director: English classes and naturalization ceremonies. So we did our first one in 2016. We did one last week in this room. 400 people, standing room only. Thank you. We had 101 applicants become citizens. So I'm very proud of those. I think it's the best. Okay, I think it's the best thing the library does. And then we have just started doing children's naturalization ceremonies, which doesn't require a federal judge, but USCIS comes down and we have a really nice ceremony for kids 5 to 13. And they get their own certificates, so it's really fun. And I give them little stuffed American eagles along with some other fun stuff. So we will be doing our second one next week. It's already next week. And the kids are getting to come dressed in costume, just not with masks on. So we also do those English classes, and we have 2 that are basics if you've never seen the U.S. alphabet. So you could be highly educated in, say, the Cyrillic alphabet, but you've never seen the American one. So we start you off with the sounds of the letters. Instead of saying ABC, which none of us ever started to learn English or any other language by being told ABC. Some of us did songs, but it's, at that point, you're hearing other people speak. That's how you're getting your language skills. So that's what we do. And we get them through. And the best part of this first one is that at week 4, someone will print their name for the very first time on a sign-in sheet. That's why we do this. And if it's a woman, I cry. So I'm almost ready to do that now. It's very important because so many women in this world were never given that opportunity for education. And we are being able to do that. We are empowering them. Never again do they have to make a mark. This is, it just makes my heart happy. And then we have a second one that picks up after like mat or bed, and then you add E at the end, and it makes a new word. So we do that. We teach the Missouri driver's license written exam. Because too many people are driving without driver's licenses. You may not have noticed that, but I have. And so we teach that to anyone 14 years and older, immigrant, refugee, or native born. And we also do financial literacy. And we do English for citizenship, which is very important because it's the answers to those 100 questions. And my favorite thing to do is to go into some place where everybody's native born and give that little 10-question test. And so many do not ever tell me how many they got right or wrong. My favorite was a senior citizen group, and the one woman quietly leaned over to her friend and said, "Did we learn this in school?" And I thought about it, thought, probably not. It was probably 30 years after you graduated. But it's a fun thing to do. If you ever want to volunteer, just look up RISE at kclibrary.org and let me know. We would love to have people help us out. We like to do 1 tutor to 1 student. It gives them the best opportunity to be successful. And if you have questions afterwards, just find me probably at the back of the room. Okay? And now I get to introduce Jody Ladd-Craig, who is the board chair for Heartland Welcome and Support Coalition. Jody? Jody? There you are.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to give you first a little bit of information about the Heartland Welcome and Support Coalition, which we fondly call the Coalition. We are a very new organization. We were incorporated in April of 2023, so we're a little more than a year and a half old. We were formed to provide whatever kind of support was needed for individuals, families who were immigrants, asylum seekers, migrant workers, and that is what we have been doing since we were incorporated. We have a board of 11 lovely, wonderful people, many of whom are here tonight, and who represent various parts of our larger community. We hope to be able to provide a variety of services, whether it be helping with housing. We recently helped buy a car for a Venezuelan family and the insurance to go along with it. There are a lot of things that need to be done to help immigrants get settled and make a life for themselves once they're here. So that is what we're about. I have to tell you, we were approached by Pat Reha. Pat, can you wave? Are you out there? I can't see you. Where'd you go? There you, oh, wait, okay. About 2 months ago, I think, with the idea of bringing our speaker tonight here, and we were very excited about that. We also have been involved in the purchase of the books so that we can make those available to teachers and schools throughout the Kansas City area. We want these stories to get told, and we hope that they will help bridge some of the gaps in knowledge that we all have about our history, particularly in relation to the southern border. So, no more about the coalition, although if you want more information, feel free to contact us. I want to now introduce Layden Rovello Krull. I'm going to have to read because I can't remember what all I wrote. Layden is currently serving as the Director of Hispanic Ministry with the Diocese of Kansas City, St. Joseph. She is a summa cum laude graduate of Fordham University. That means she's very smart. Relevant to her role tonight is the fact that she is the daughter of Honduran and Puerto Rican immigrant parents, giving her a personal connection to the immigrant experience that informs her passionate advocacy. Layden's influence extends nationally and internationally. She serves on key committees such as I am not a Spanish speaker, so give me a little leeway here, the Equipo Regional de Acompañamiento del Quinto Encuentro. If anyone knows what that is. Thank you. And she also serves on the national team of Catholic social teaching facilitators. Most recently, she presented on the impact of immigration in the United States at the 2024 International Eucharistic Congress in Quito, Ecuador, further solidifying her status as a thought leader in this issue. We are very happy to have Layden with us tonight. She will serve as the moderator and help take questions after our speaker's presentation. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Pat, for making this happen. We need to give Pat a big round of applause. And now, I bring you Layden.
I bet her $5 she wasn't going to get that. Now I got to pay up. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Dorado Romo. Dr. Romo is an accomplished author, historian, and musician with a deep-rooted connection to the U.S. Mexico borderlands. His family's history in El Paso spans generations. It's dating back to 1647, when his ninth-generation great-grandfather crossed the Rio Grande. He's a Stanford University graduate with a degree in history, philosophy, and Judaic studies. I'm exhausted. Dr. Romo later earned his PhD in Borderlands history from the University of Texas at El Paso. And his passion for education and community engagement led him to establish the Southside Education Center, where he taught chess, music, and theater to the youth in Segundo Barrio. Dr. Romo is the author of 2 notable books, Ringside Seat to a Revolution, An Underground Cultural History of El Paso and Juarez, 1893 to 1923. We're still waiting to hear what happened the rest of the days. And recently published Borderlands and the Mexican-American Story. His work has been featured in prestigious publications such as the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and Texas Monthly. As a co-founder of Paso del Sur, if you are not exhausted by the amount of work this man has done, Dr. Romo actively advocates for the preservation of El Paso's historic neighborhoods against gentrification. His unique blend of academic expertise, his personal connection to the borderlands, and his commitment to community activism makes him a compelling voice, an important voice on the U.S. Mexico border issues. I'm excited to share that for those of you who are moved by Dr. Romo's talk today, there are copies available for purchase. The Borderlands copies are available. And for teachers and students, if you can prove that you're a teacher or a student, they are very generously provided free of charge through the Heartland Foundation that we just learned about. And this generous offer allows Dr. Romo's important work to reach even more minds and inspire further understanding of the Mexican-American experience. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Dorado Romo.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor to be here. I want to thank the Kansas City Public Library. Even in El Paso, we know that this is a prestigious place, and I'm super honored. I want to thank the Heartland Support and the Welcome and Support Coalition, and especially Patrick Rija. He has done an incredible job of spreading the word. I met Patrick with a group of people from here, from Kansas City, that went down to El Paso. I give presentations and walking tours through the Catholic diocese about immigration, and we've created this connection. I studied Nahuatl, which is the language of the Mexica people, commonly known as the Aztecs, but they called themselves Mexica. They didn't call themselves Aztecs. And the very first lesson, what we learn is how to say thank you. It's tlazocamati, and it means you know how to love. And if you ask somebody for their name, what's your name? You say Kentimoteca, which means how did they plant you? And if you want to know how are you, it's Kentimoyetstika, which means how's your blood, right? So just those 3 words, first lesson in Nahuatl, you know that you've entered another world. I want to start with something called, it's a sermon that there are also Yuto Aztecan people in northern Mexico, the Raramuri, people might know them as a Tarahumara, and they do something called a Nahuesari outside of the church. And they usually, they're short homilies. They tell people to be kind to others, to treat animals well, to treat nature well. And so I'm going to start with, I play in this band called Los Liminals, and we do music from all places, really. It's the frontera, that in-between line. And this is something that we start off our presentations with. This flute is used among the pueblos, also the Lakota. So the Lakota call this flute sillotanca, and it's a love flute. It's a flute used for courting, make people fall in love with you. mujer tahu, we raramuri hu. Ta mujer lina no ka y huevana gawi. Ta mujer tahu gawitonara. So the Raramuri people are saying, ta mujer, we, tahu, are Raramuri hu. We are the Raramuri people, the people with pies ligeros, with light feet, the light-footed people, the people that are constantly in movement. Because for the Raramuris, if you stop moving, if you stop dancing, you die. You become rigid. You become unhealthy. Ta mujer lina no ka y huevana gawi. They say, nosotros somos los que sostenemos el mundo. We are the people that sustain the world. It is our responsibility to take care of nature, to take care of each other. Ta mujer tahu tonara. We are the pillars of the world. And that's how they start their Nawesari on Sunday morning, not inside the church, but outside the church. Is this working? You hear me? Yes, good. So, the name of my book is Borderlands in the Mexican-American Story. It's supposed to be for young adults or middle grade students. So I wrote it in a way which I explain everything in a very accessible way. So my sentences are very short. Some of you may have already started reading it. They would ask me to explain what is the Civil War, what is capitalism, what is any word, any term that was too difficult. They wanted me to add a sentence or two. So I did. But in reality, this book is for young people of all ages. And I can see that a lot of you might be educators. I've talked to, it's not a Mexican-American story for dummies. It's for smarties. It's for people that, even though you have a PhD in history, there might be something here that you hadn't thought about. Not only the information, but the connections that I make. Stories. Everybody has a story. Like when you go to a therapist, they try to figure out your healing process through the story you tell yourself. And a therapist will tell you, well, if you were told as a kid that you were dumb or that you were somehow not competent in something, you're probably going to carry that with you. Or the opposite, if you're told that you're beautiful, or that you're told that you're a great athlete, that story is going to affect you somehow, and maybe you have to prove your worth by constantly competing and showing people how good you are. These stories, I had a story that I told myself when I was a kid. So I was born in the United States, in San Jose, California, to a farm worker. My father came here when he was 14. He only went to 6th grade. And he crossed back in the day when there was something called Operation Wetback during the Eisenhower administration. And that was a word that they used in the media, wetback. Today, it's a racist term. You're not going to use that term. But they did back then. He was stopped by a Border Patrol agent because he crossed without papers, in unauthorized fashion. And he was pretty much physically abused. The Border Patrol agent left him with a gash. And he would tell me that story. And to him, he said, it was no big deal. It wasn't a very deep wound. But there's something called intergenerational trauma. And I remember that story wounding me, right? And so when we would go, my mother was also from Mexico and from Ciudad Juarez. And they would take me to meetings, PTA meetings. And they couldn't speak English very well. And I remember, or not at all. And I remember the other kids who were more assimilated, Mexican-American kids in El Paso, making fun of us and me and my accent. And so that story always was something that I told myself, that somehow my language skills are insufficient. And so sometimes bad stories make you do good things. I ended up studying many languages. So not only Nahuatl, Right now I'm trying to teach myself Ende, Apache. I've learned Italian, Hebrew, French, studying Arabic, Japanese. So that story led me to do stuff I probably wouldn't have done if I didn't have that story. The Mexican-American story. What is the Mexican-American story? Borderlands. Borders, natural. I was thinking today that a lot of what has happened in El Paso was influenced by your area. So El Paso del Norte was what the town that I'm from was called by the Spaniards. El Paso del Rio Norte means the pass of the Northern River. But beginning in the 1840s, 1850s, the first Anglos that went to El Paso called it Franklin. And I had studied the fact that there were a whole bunch of wagoneers from Missouri, from this area, that called it Franklin. And I couldn't figure out why would they call it Franklin after Benjamin Franklin. Well, that's because the Santa Fe Trail began not at Independence, but at Franklin. And this was the borderlands. If I ask you to do a little pop quiz, before 1848, what 10 states, either in their entirety or in part, used to be Mexico? Just yell it out, everybody knows. Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, California, Arizona, Utah. I said Colorado, a slice of Kansas, right? A slice of Oklahoma, a slice of Wyoming. Those are 10 states. So this was the border, right here. This was the Mexican-U.S. border before 1848. And so the first group of people that went down to invade Mexico, and I talk about that in this book, was Colonel Alexander Donovan, and he had the Missouri Volunteers. And they were the people that, when they took over El Paso del Norte, one of the first things that they did is that they would erase the records, especially the land deeds, the historical records in the missions. Why? Because if you tear down a people's story, well, first of all, you can't prove that it's your land, but also you can displace people when they don't have a story. So I talk about the Mexican-American story. Imagine growing up not knowing who your parents are, or perhaps being told that somebody else are your parents and they're not really your parents, and you have no story at all. Imagine somebody just zaps, and they zap your memory. How can you live without a story? And the only stories you're told are negative stories, that you're dirty, that you're inferior, all kinds of, and those are the stories that you have to live with all of your life. So Borderlands and the Mexican-American story is an attempt to dig up, to recover some of the stories that I definitely didn't know about. Now I realize that almost everything they told me was false. Starting with Columbus discovered America in 1492. That seems to be a fact, but is it really, right? So it would be saying like, there's people from wherever, from Mississippi came here and they discovered Missourians, right? Oh, the people from Missouri were already here. So there's a little bias there, a big bias, that it's only who is doing the discovering and who is being discovered. Or that the first Thanksgiving, I talk about it in my book, was Plymouth Rock in 1620. And when they landed, that was the first Thanksgiving. By the way, what food did the pilgrims eat when they land on Plymouth Rock? Corn, right? And sausage, not sausage, squash and beans. Everybody knows the turkey. So where was that food first cultivated? Mexico, Mesoamerica, right? So basically they were eating Mexican food. The the first gringos, Anglos to land ate Mexican food, right? So the question is, how the heck did Mexican food end up there, right? Well, it's the same way that the Uto-Aztecan language from Mexico is all over the Southwest. The Comanches speak the Mexica, a relative of the Mexica language. The Utes, the Paiutes, the Shoshone, the Coahuiltecos in California. So you have people in Montana and Idaho speaking that language. So the stories that the Mexica tell themselves of their origin is that there was a migration from the north to the south. So El Paso has been a migration story for thousands of years. But that migration isn't like the migration of Ellis Island. People like to call El Paso the other Ellis Island. No. Ellis Island is a one-way migration. The Europeans come in. Some of them have a hard time because they're not exactly defined as white, and so the Irish, the Polish, the Catholic, even some of the Eastern European Jews are not seen completely as white, and then it takes a while, then they assimilate. But that's a one-way east to west migration. The north to south and back and forth is a transnational migration. It's one that has been going on for thousands of years, as old as some of these footsteps. For a long time, and these are all the things that I say once again, we've been taught falsehoods. For a long time, I thought, like everybody else, that the first native people came through the Bering Strait up between Russia and Alaska somewhere. That was that because it was frozen over, there's a connection. Some people said 12,000 years ago, maybe 16,000 at the most. There was a short period where they could come. And indeed, the Mexica people did come as one of those migrations from Siberia, northern Canada. And their language is very similar. I've studied Japanese, so it's very similar to some Asian languages. But these footprints, that's how I start my book. They were discovered around 2006, if I can recall correctly. For a long time, people didn't know what these footsteps were. Then they found some little grass seeds in between, and they dated them back to 23,000 years ago. So according to the earlier anthropological, archaeological theories, it was impossible that there were native footsteps that long back, because most archaeologists were white, and they wanted to say that the native presence in these lands was a relatively recent phenomena. So when other archaeologists would find evidence that native people had been here 30,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, they would say that's preposterous. It does not fit in within our theory of the Bering Strait crossing. And this proves it beyond any kind of doubt that there were definitely people in what is now considered the Borderlands at least 23,000 years ago. So you have to go back to the drawing board whenever you're studying history. Why are these stories important? And how do they connect to the story of migration? Well, I've already told you there's a different, once you think in terms of north and south, you see a whole different perspective. All of a sudden, the first Thanksgiving is not 1620 at Plymouth Rock. By the way, the Wampanoag people called it Patuxet. It wasn't Plymouth Rock. And when you cross with 400 Europeans from Spain through El Paso del Norte, the people were called Shawi Irewe, but the Spaniards called them the Mansos, the tame people, the domesticated people. Even though they were not tame at all, they resisted colonization for many, 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 many years. They had their first Thanksgiving there, 20 years before, in 1598. That was the first group of 400 settlers that went in with the intention of colonizing. This is what I wrote in order to, to submit something to see if I was going to be chosen. This is to submit something to see if I was going to be chosen. This is part of a series. What I wrote, it's called the race for the truth. So there's one book that talks about slavery and the African Americans, Chinese and the exclusion and the Chinese American story, and then there's the colonization, the Wampanoag story, and then mine, the Mexican American story, Borderlands. So I submitted this, and it starts like this. On the morning of November 2nd, 1937, students at Bowie High School in El Paso waited for the morning bell to ring. They felt nervous. They didn't know it, but they were about to make history. As soon as the bell rang, about 200 Mexican American students walked out of their classrooms. It was the first student walkout held at a predominantly Mexican American high school in the United States. They left their red brick school building without saying a word. Many of them carried signs, "We are not hungry." Some of the students carried a milk bottle under one arm and a loaf of bread under the other. They marched silently towards the offices of the El Paso Herald. The newspaper offices were not too far from where Bowie High School was located. A few days before, the El Paso Herald had published articles that students felt insulted their dignity. The articles made them feel ashamed. The bold headline of one article read, "Bowie High School students face hunger again. Girls lie down in the restroom and weep as others eat at noon. Some save scraps for supper." Although calling someone hungry in English is not usually considered an insult, the students felt embarrassed to be singled out publicly, the way the newspaper article did. In Spanish, the term "un muerto de hambre," a starveling, is considered an insult. The newspaper wrote that hunger made many Bowie students faint. It added that even some of the football players have become so weakened through hunger that they could not play well. So I start with this story of a very strange, you could almost say it was insignificant, petty. They were, the newspapers had written something, and they didn't mean to offend them. They were actually trying to do something good for them. They were trying to raise money for food, but they did it in a very kind of humiliating way. And so when they went to play with the other high schools, that predominantly Anglo high schools, they would laugh at these Mexican kids and say, "Oh, you guys are muertos de hambre, you're starvelings," and what have you. So insulted their pride, their dignity. But that's how young people could relate at that time. They were developing a consciousness. There was a much bigger thing going on that is not taught in our school curriculum. Some people might know it as the Mexican repatriation, but it shouldn't be called the Mexican repatriation. During the Great Depression, President Hoover scapegoated Mexicans as the people that were stealing American jobs. And Mexicans, whether they were born in the United States or not, they weren't real Americans. So what do you have to do in order to solve the economic crisis? You push them back to Mexico. Go back to Mexico. There were all kinds of signs everywhere. People would be put in trains, and sometimes they didn't even have a chance to pack their bags or anything, and they were shipped back to Mexico. The problem with calling it Mexican repatriation, scholars don't know the exact numbers. Some estimate that it was 600,000 people over a period of several years in the 30s. Others estimate as high as 2 million. So some estimate that 1.2 million of those people sent back to Mexico were US-born citizens, young people that were forced to go back with their parents. So of course this has relevance today, right? Donald Trump has said that he is going to kick out people. He's mentioned Operation Wetback. He doesn't mention this 1930s thing, because if you kick people out of this country, what happens to their US-born children? Well, they end up going to a land where they don't even speak the language. So there's all these stories of the suffering of people who were forcibly. That's how it intersects in their daily life. You see, in El Paso, if you go and you ask for aid, and then you're Mexican, they'll stamp your passport, they'll stamp your ID, they'll stamp your documents. So if your parents go back and your passport shows that you've accepted some kind of charity from a welfare organization, they don't let you back into the United States. So you're de facto deported from the country. So that's what it's about, but they don't talk about it directly. There's a whole bunch of other, the cover here is Severita Lara. So Severita Lara was the student leader of another student protest. And I'm focusing on young people so that young people can see themselves as agents of change, that they're resisting, not only just accepting passively what's going on around them. I'm not really focusing on the great man theory of history, because that's what they want to teach us in schools, that it takes usually a great man, once in a while a great woman, but it's usually a great man that really changes. They're the presidents and the kings. No, I'm trying to tell a different story, a bottom-up story of common everyday people doing incredible stuff for their community. And this was one of these people, Severita Lara, 17 years old. And another thing that is kind of, whoa, one of the most effective student strikes walked out in Texas, southern Texas, Crystal City, was over the issue of cheerleaders. Why? Because this was a school in Crystal City, Texas, that was predominantly Mexican-American. And the cheerleaders, 75% of the cheerleaders had to be white, and only one Mexican-American was allowed to be a cheerleader. And they went up to the principal and said, hey, that's not fair, it should be 50-50. The principal said no. They went up to the superintendent, that's not fair, we want an equal amount of cheerleaders. And the superintendent said no. So they got angry. And they said, it's not only the cheerleaders, you know what? We don't have any books on what they call Chicano history. We don't have enough Mexican-American teachers. We shouldn't be sent to Spanish detention. Because if we speak Spanish in your schools, sometimes you'll swat us, sometimes you'll send us to detention, sometimes you'll tape our mouths shut. You make us feel inferior for speaking our own language. So they got more and more bold as they went along. It started off with one little tiny demand. We want an equal amount of cheerleaders. And it became one of the most successful student strikes in the history of the Chicano movement. So all of these things are parts of the stories that are usually not told. How does this relate to the immigration story? Well, it goes back to my story. For a long time, I've learned what it means, this concept of what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be an American, what it means to be a Mexican American has gradually changed as I go along. Because for a long time, I thought I was, people called me second generation Mexican American, because that means my parents were born in Mexico, and I was born in the United States, because, as I said, my father came here sin papeles, quote unquote, illegally. And so what he ended up is picking avocados in California. Later, he got a job in Palo Alto, California, and he picked trash in California. He was a garbage man. And so I ended up moving back with the family to Juarez, the Mexican side, and then El Paso at the age of 4, graduated from high school. My father bought a gas station. He did pretty decently well. You know, this is part of the immigrant story, right? Opportunities, you better yourself. So well that he paid my way through Stanford University. I got accepted to both Harvard and Stanford. And I asked him, Papa, Dad, which school should I go to, Harvard or Stanford? He goes, go to Stanford. I said, why? Because I went there before you. I said, what do you mean? You're not... I said, I used to pick the trash of the professors there, right? And so that was like full circle. So that's a beautiful kind of immigrant make good story. I'm a second generation. If I stop there, wow, you know, I can run for president with that story, right? But the story of immigration is more complicated. My mother met my father in, you know, I mean, if you really get honest, there's all these nuances, right? So my mother met my father while he was working as a garbage man. in California. She was working in a restaurant there. Her name is Juana Dorado, and she changed her name to Jenny. She was trying to assimilate. And so when I was born in a county hospital. And my father was already making, decent money. And so something happened that my mother could no longer have children after I was born. There were complications. Her tubes were tight, her fallopian tubes. And she always blamed my father. She said, "It's your fault. Eres un tacaño." In Spanish, those of you that speak Spanish, you're a cheapskate. Why didn't you take me to a private hospital? You had enough money. So she had this rencor. My mother was Pentecostal, and she couldn't cuss, but she would tell the hermanas, hermanos, the brothers and sisters in Christ, when she was pissed off at them, "Dios los bendiga, God bless you." And that wasn't good. If somebody tells you God bless you like that, you say, "Well, bless you back, sister," right? So she wasn't as forgiving as my father was. Okay, I better finish this talk. So, because I went on a little too long, but I want to give you one more story. It's a family story, and it has to do with my great aunt. It's my tía Adela Dorado. She came here with my grandmother during the Mexican Revolution. A lot of the Mexican-American community here came during the Mexican Revolution, fleeing all kinds of strife in Mexico. Mexican Revolution at first started off as relatively bloodless. And then what happened? The U.S. went in and they orchestrated a military coup and created all sort of chaos. So hundreds of thousands of people ended up in the United States because of U.S. intervention in Mexico. So there's another connection. This is my tía Adela Dorado. She tells me a story when I'm in high school that I had a hard time hearing because nobody had told me this story. It had to do with that whenever she would cross into El Paso from Juarez to work as a maid, she would have to strip naked. And then at the International Bridge, they would fumigate her with these dangerous chemical substances. And she says, that made me feel very humiliated, but what really stuck, I remember her telling her, is that she took care of her appearance. She kind of looks like a flapper, and so she had just brought these new shoes, and she had to put them in a secadora. So the Spanish word for secadora means dryer, and in my mind I thought those electric tumbler dryers. And she said, when they gave them back to me, the agents at the International Bridge between El Paso and Juarez, at the Santa Fe International Bridge, they had melted. And I remember she told me that, and that detail stuck in my mind. I was like, really? They didn't have, maybe your memory, tía, great aunt, it's kind of fuzzy. So I didn't want to believe her completely. And later, when I was doing research for my first book, Ring Sightsee to a Revolution, I found these photographs at the National Archives in the Washington, D.C. area in College Park. And I saw what my aunt was talking about. This is the secadora, so this is a steam dryer. And here are some hats and some shoes. So I remember seeing that picture and saying my great aunt's memory was not that blurry. It was not that fuzzy. So this is some other photographs that I found in that same box of archival material. They're checking to see if people have trachoma, any kind of disease, people that are crossing from Mexico and the United States. And then I found this map. And that map is it's of the El Paso quarantine or disinfection plant. And you feel kind of like a detective when you're finding these kinds of documents. So you go in through the entrance, and here it says undressing room, here an attendance room that is right next to where people are undressing. And then right here, this square That's the secadora, that's the dryer. And then right here it says gas room. I remember I skipped a little, I said, gas room, that sounds a little eerie. But no, it can't be, whatever associations I had. But if you're a detective, you're gonna ask the obvious questions. What kind of gas? And so that led me to a whole search. I talk about that in this book. Can you help me set up the video? Por favor, please. I'm not sure how to work this one.
Everything we know about Carmelita Torres is from a few newspaper accounts in 1917. They called her an auburn-haired Amazon, just 17 years old. She led angry women in anti-American rioting and shut down the U.S. Mexico border. But hidden within her story is something much bigger than a single riot. It's a story about American paranoia at the border, about a toxic campaign of disinfection and discrimination, and a U.S. practice that would go on to inspire Nazi scientists.
I'll write down one word and then after it.
At the border between El Paso, Texas and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, thousands of people cross back and forth for work and school every day. They line up in Juarez and often wait for hours to get through the U.S. checkpoint. But the border didn't always look like this.
Crossing this border used to be free and unrestricted. People would come and go without a passport. But after 1917, Juarez and El Paso became two separate communities.
Wait, did we finally agree?
All the destinations to get the trip out of the group chat. That's what the world's biggest airline can do for you.
You'll get better when you're not blamed.
It was a turbulent year at the border. The Mexican Revolution was ongoing, and the U.S. was about to enter World War I.
All of a sudden, you have the war hysteria created by World War I. People here in El Paso that are deadly afraid that the Germans are going to attack from Ciudad Juarez.
The fear of invasion brought tensions to the border, while across the U.S., a different movement was gaining strength. The eugenics movement, based on junk science, aimed to create a genetically and morally superior population. That meant stricter controls on immigration, only allowing those deemed fit to enter. On Ellis Island, one of the busiest ports of entry at the time, U.S. health officials were tasked with weeding out immigrants they thought were unfit or disease carriers. And across the country, that process coincided with the stereotyping of Mexicans as inferior and unclean. Dozens of film titles included the word greaser, a derogatory term used to describe Mexicans. This racist sentiment was strong at the U.S. Mexico border. El Paso's mayor, Tom Lee, had developed an obsession with cleanliness, and it defined his political platform.
This obsession with not only racial purity, but physical purity. He was going to literally clean up El Paso from all these bad elements. And by bad elements, he often meant racially bad elements.
One of Mayor Lee's biggest fears was a disease called typhus, spread by lice. So, under the pretense of sanitary betterment work, he helped lead a campaign to inspect every house in a predominantly Mexican neighborhood. If the inspectors found lice, occupants were forced to take vinegar and kerosene baths, have their heads shaved, and clothing burned. Hundreds of homes were eventually destroyed. Lee also expanded the supposed health measures to include inmates in the El Paso jail.
They had to strip naked, take a bath inside a tub full of kerosene, and on one occasion, it seems somebody lit a match.
27 prisoners, majority Mexican or Mexican American, burned to death in the fire that the newspapers called the jail Holocaust. But despite the tragic fire, Mayor Lee pushed forward with even more aggressive plans.
He sends a telegram, a Western Union telegram, to Rupert Blue, who was the Surgeon General up in Washington, D.C. And basically, well, let me just read it. Hundreds dirty, lousy, destitute Mexicans arriving at El Paso daily will undoubtedly bring and spread typhus unless a quarantine is placed at once.
The government didn't agree to a full quarantine because evidence suggested that typhus wasn't a major threat in the area. But instead, they funded a new disinfection plant at the border in 1916. In this facility, every immigrant considered a second-class citizen had to strip naked. Their clothes were sent to a large steam dryer and then fumigated with toxic pesticides inside the gas room. An inspector would check each person's body, including private parts, for lice. If they found lice, immigrants would have to shave their head and body hair and bathe in a mix of kerosene and vinegar. Some even had their eyelids checked for things like pink eye, and many had to complete puzzles or simple IQ tests to prove that they were fit for entry. After this process, they'd receive a ticket as proof that they were disinfected, but they would need to go through this every 8 days in order to re-enter the U.S.
So many people didn't speak about it. They didn't talk about this humiliating process, like they kind of internalized it. It's that psychology of shame.
The toxic baths and dehumanizing inspections at the border set the stage for a revolt, led by the 17-year-old maid from Juarez who defied the order to bathe.
I've compared it to the Rosa Parks of the border. In the morning of January 28th, 1917, there's this electric trolley full of mostly women that are crossing every day. She convinces the majority, if not all, the women in that trolley to just say no and to refuse. They start a spontaneous protest.
There are accounts that in addition to the humiliating delousing procedures, for women, there was also sexual humiliation.
There were rumors that, when they entered the plant and then they were told to strip, officers were taking their photos and then posting them in bars. So I can't even imagine the kind of feeling, like the feelings of violation and the feelings of, outrage.
She was called an instigator, a ringleader, but she was just a young woman that was just sick of the injustice, of the humiliation that other women had gone through.
What started with just 200 protesters that morning slowly grew to a crowd of 2,000. Reporters said the scene reminded one of bees swarming. The hands of the feminine mob would claw at the tops of the passing cars. When the American officers tried to disperse the crowd, they were met with bottles, rocks, and insults. Protesters even laid down on the tracks in front of the trolley cars to create a blockade. They were joined by men in what's called the Bath Riots, and they shut down this border for 2 days.
And then all you hear is that the ringleaders are arrested, and a few of the men are publicly executed.
As for Carmelita Torres,
it appears like she was thrown in prison, and as historians, we don't know what happened to her afterwards. We've lost every trace.
the fumigations didn't stop after the riots. In 1917 alone, over 100,000 Mexicans were deloused at the border. That same year, an immigration law made border procedures even more rigid. Immigrants at all points of entry needed to have a passport, take a literacy test, and many would have to pay an $8 head tax. And later that year, the U.S. Public Health Service laid down instructions for border agents about who should be kept out of the country.
Imbeciles, idiots, feeble-minded persons, physical defectives, persons afflicted with loathsome or dangerous contagious diseases,
The discriminatory policies at the border resembled horrific events elsewhere in the world. In fact, while researching this, David stumbled upon a detail. The fumigation of Mexican immigrants wasn't just reminiscent of Nazi Germany, it was directly linked to it.
It's not so much that the United States was copying Nazi Germany, it's the opposite. Nazi Germany was copying the United States.
He found that in the 1920s, the US started using Zyklon B, an extremely poisonous acid gas, to fumigate clothing at the border. And in 1937, in a German pest science journal, a scientist called for the use of Zyklon B in Nazi disinfection chambers. He included 2 photos of El Paso's delousing chambers as an example of how effective Zyklon B had been at the US border to kill unwanted pests. The same scientist pushed to use it to disinfect concentration camps, and eventually it was used in concentrated doses to murder millions of people.
People, rightly so, say you can't compare what happened in Nazi Germany with other parts of the world. And that's true. In terms of Zyklon B, it was used on the border not to intentionally kill Mexican border crossers. But the history of something like the Holocaust doesn't take place in a vacuum.
A few decades after the Bath riots, Mexico started sending men to work on US farms and railroads as part of a new labor agreement called the Bracero Program. And through the program, the border disinfections continued.
Here in this facility, some migrants were sprayed with insecticides.
This time, it was a substance called DDT,
Dichloro-diphenyl-trichloroethane,
a toxic pesticide which decades later would be banned for agricultural use by most developed countries.
Repeated contact must be avoided.
They were sprayed in the face. They were sprayed in their private parts. And, they were stripped naked and inspected. And sometimes they're inspected like you would inspect livestock.
First-hand accounts from immigrants in the program reveal how little they knew about the fumigations.
So they talk about how humiliating it was, about why do they think we're so dirty? They'll call it the white powder. I don't know if they necessarily were told we're spraying you with DDT, but they'll call it polvo, the powder.
Miraculous white powder that is helping to win the war against disease.
Many of the employees who worked in the facilities weren't given many details either.
When I first started, my role was a clerk. I got the job mainly because I spoke Spanish. There was a hut in the area when they came in from the Mexican side that they were going there, and they had some sort of, it was for lice, they said. It was, to disinfect for lice. And we never gave it much thought, but we did think, that's sort of like what the Nazis used to do, to the Jews.
I had heard during lunch breaks that they would spray them, and sometimes there were comments from the men themselves that they would put a hose to them. I don't know if they knew what they were doing to them. I certainly didn't know, It was far-fetched from the world we lived in.
It wasn't until the 1960s, when the Bracero program ended, that health authorities acknowledged the chemicals were dangerous and the baths and fumigations were finally discontinued.
You want history to be about progress, about everybody realizes how horrible it is, and then it stops. Unfortunately, that's how it works in movies, but this was the border, right? And in the border, a lot of things never become resolved. They just keep on repeating themselves.
Decades after the disinfection campaign ended, the language, the strategy, and the dehumanizing politics of fear and exclusion still linger.
It's a health issue, too, because We don't know what people have coming in here.
They're coming in with diseases such as smallpox and leprosy and TB that are going to infect our people in the United States.
It's just a fact. You're going to see disease outbreak.
Apprehensions in the El Paso area specifically have spiked more than 600%.
They are essentially being warehoused, as many as 300 children in a cell.
Without adequate food, water, and sanitation.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border.
I don't like anything compared to the Holocaust.
But why can't you compare it, his practices, to what led up to the Holocaust? Do we have to wait for the actual Holocaust before we speak out?
At the border between Juarez and El Paso, the same space where the Bath riots once happened, hundreds of migrants have been huddled in makeshift detention centers. They've been waiting to find out if the U.S. government deems them fit for entry.
As always, there's so much information that we couldn't fit in this video, but I wanted to leave you guys with one last bit of information from David Romo's book. So in 1918, the southern border region was hit with its worst epidemic in history. And it wasn't typhus, it was the Spanish flu. The best evidence we have suggests it was actually from Kansas, brought to the border by American soldiers. Just wanted to leave you guys that tidbit. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to share more episodes of Missing Chapter soon.
Fresh agave taste.
You have to say about what you just saw or what you heard today, and any questions as well. And I don't know if Layden is going to start off by...
So that was super impactful. We have been generously conceded more time. So you didn't pay for parking, so you're here until we're ending. If there's anyone with a burning question in their minds and hearts, I would really I want this to be a conversation between you all and Dr. Romo. Yeah, I'm just here because I look really good on camera, guys. It's true. So, first question. And do we have anything from the interwebs? I'm told there's potentially. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I've enjoyed learning. Besides reading your book, what do you want us to do next with the information you've given us? How can we best be of service to ourselves and to the larger community?
Are you an educator?
No.
Okay.
I'm just being educated by you, so.
Okay. Because I asked this question because I know that there's probably quite a few educators. What happens when a story is eliminated from the public consciousness, like when we're zapped? I don't think my talk is going to make any difference in the elections. You know, like what you saw today, you probably already came here with your mind made up. It's not like it's going to change the politics immediately. But stories do have the power to heal. And I think healing, fixing the past, repairing the past. Some people call it reparations, and they immediately think of money or what have you. People crossed this border and they were sprayed in the face with DDT that has the potential of causing cancer. Nobody ever apologized for that. Nobody ever apologized for the illegal deportation of maybe 1.2 million Mexican Americans. So how do we even get there if we don't know this story? If these stories have been zapped? Just out of curiosity, how many of you, other than those that read my book, because I talk about that, knew about this, the use of Cyclone B at the border? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It wasn't anything that they taught you in school. Why not? Is it not important history? So the question is, why not? And what do we do? How do we tell these stories? So, number one, please tell these stories. Stories have the power to heal. They also have the power to connect us. in Texas and Florida, I'm not sure about your laws here, they're passing these laws where these kind of stories are illegal. I mean, one of the books in my series, the one that talks about Native Americans and colonization, Texas has decided to censor it in a very kind of sneaky way. They put it on the fiction section of the library. Right, that's almost evil. That's almost brilliant. It's a brilliant way of... So we need your help in speaking out and saying, these 10,000 books that have been banned, just Texas alone has banned 500, shouldn't be banned. They should be out there. And yeah, some of these themes might be so deep and so hard that parents should talk about it with their children. So I think in answer to your question is, first step is tell the story. And then we have to figure out how to connect our humanity. It's all about stories. Trump is great at telling stories, but stories that dehumanize people, that make people fear, that make people hate. How do we tell stories of solidarity, of compassion, of love, of other kinds of stories? And connect these stories. So how do these stories that you'll read in my book connect to your story, right? In Texas, they're saying we can't teach these stories because they're going to make white children, white students uncomfortable. Well, sometimes healing, you got to uncover the wound. It has to be uncomfortable. But it's not about, I'm not telling these stories to make white people feel uncomfortable. I'm telling it to see if we might connect their humanity. That's why I'm telling these stories.
We have a couple questions from online, if it's okay me to throw those up. The first is, do you think it would be valuable or useful for American students to take a course on Mexican-American history in high school?
Absolutely. Mexican-Americans, brown people of mixed Native and Hispanic descent. And there's so many names that they use. They call us Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx. I call myself fronterizo, which means a border person that's kind of simultaneously, because my families have been going back and forth for decades and generations. So yes, I mean, just the numbers. We are the largest, Latinos are the largest quote unquote minority in the United States. Yet we're absolutely invisible. Like most of you hadn't heard the majority of the stories. If you read my book, I think most of you probably don't know these stories because they're not taught. Teaching is the first step to healing. But I know that there's a movement in Tucson in the year 2010, Mexican-American studies was declared illegal in the school system, in the Texas school system. We have to change that. So it's a very definite yes.
The other question we have from online, you spent the day in Kansas City. Did you learn anything interesting about the Mexican-American population in art?
The director of the Guadalupe Center, who is here today, for giving me a tour of their center. What I learned is in 1919, around the same time that my great aunt was crossing and being fumigated, there were, I don't know, thousands of Mexicanos that were fleeing the violence in Mexico. But even before that, I know that there's this famous corrido, and I talk about it in my book. Corridos are the folk songs that are like these musicians, they keep the stories of poor people. And they have the corrido de Kansas, the folk songs of Kansas. They misspelled Kansas. And it was written around the late 1850s. And these were vaqueros. The word buckaroo comes from the Spanish word vaquero. It means cowboys. Everybody thinks that cowboys, that's the heart of America. That was Mexican, right? So it was the vaqueros who brought the cattle up from Texas to Kansas, from South Texas. And they wrote a corrido. So they were already here in the 1850s, 1860s, eating burritos. The first, burritos with flour tortillas, and they would have, they would put meat and beans and all that. They were these buckaroos, these Mexican vaqueros. And so this connection between the first traqueros, they were the railroad workers. Once the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited Chinese from working in the railroad, something like 2/3 of all the people that were building the railroads were Mexicanos, and many of them ended up here. And that's all to thank you to Araceli's tour today, right? So it's a fascinating part. I talk about the traqueros in my book being also in places like Kansas City.
So before we get to your question, only because I don't want to forget this thought, and I'm going to. So I work for the Catholic Church, the Diocese of Kansas City here in St. Joseph, and in Missouri rather. And the story of the Latino experience is a very Catholic experience as well. The first Mass having been celebrated in Florida when it was still part of the Spanish lands in the 1500s. And so one of the things that I love that you said was bad stories make you do good things. One of the efforts I make, because I represent the diaspora of the Hispanic Latino experience in my diocese, which means that I see people who are just coming into the U.S. I see also Latinos, especially Mexican Americans, because that's Kansas, who have been here for at least 100 years, sometimes pushed here from the Cristero Wars, where the communists in Mexico were persecuting Catholics, and Catholics, in fact, the first Mass celebrated in Missouri was a priest that was expelled from Mexico, and his life was saved by the people who brought him here. So it's a story that is really tied together. And one of the things that I always remind our young adults especially is that, the las heridas del pasado, those wounds from our past, they don't define the potential in our future. And of course, you're an example. Here you are, Dr. David Romo, whose parents had humble beginnings, but and the fact that in the U.S. people continue to come because there is hope. And I want our young adults to know that there is a balance. There's a tension, but there's also a balance. You know and learn your history because you have to restore that memoria histórica. You have to restore the historical memory. But it's not the thing that defines you so that you can't find your future here, because you have to be part of the story. And what do you think about that? About how do we balance that tension for our young adults?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question that I struggled with in writing this book. A lot, most of the stories that I heard that had anything to do with Hispanics, Mexican Americans, were feel-good stories. The first, and it went. Also, when I would read African American stories back in high school, this was the first African American that did this. This was the first Mexican American that did this, and what have you. They were always kind of very positive. And to me, they didn't go to the heart of the matter. I still didn't feel included by those stories. It's like, well, why did they take so long? Maybe it's not a story of progress of brown and black people. It's a story of progress of white people that finally allowed one guy to become mayor, the first mayor of a major city, Cisneros. To me, that wasn't the story that I wanted. So I want that balance. So when I write these stories, I do tell stories of how there's young kids, fourth graders in California, that they go up to their Senate, the state Senate, and try to pass laws that you have to teach the so-called Mexican repatriation as part of the textbooks, where you're showing resistance, you're showing memory, and of course, pride in your cultura. So I talk a lot about muralists and artists, and that's why I'm a musician, because that's what keeps me sane. So when, in answer to your question, yes, we have all these very painful stories. My great aunt that would tell me this story of going through the bath rites, she was the happiest, warmest, most loving person I've ever met, right? So yeah, out of that suffering, there's pearls, right? And that's why when I see the magical Mexican señoras anywhere, like I rode up to Route 66 and then Highway 54, and I would go to these little restaurants, and those are the grandmas, the abuelas, and they're so beautiful, So yes, those negative stories have created very positive experiences for us. Does that mean that it's good that happened? No. we have to find the justice.
Have to make sure we don't repeat those mistakes.
That we do it to others.
Right, right.
Absolutely.
Thanks for telling us about what was going on 100 years ago. I didn't know anything about that. I knew about after World War II, when the veterans came back, they ran a whole bunch of people off. And my question is, I worked for Homeland Security under Trump, and he raised the price in the years it took to get your citizenship, and now it's like $18,000 in 7 years. And if you're in a large family, you can never afford that. So do you know of any solution for that part of it?
Any solution to that part of what Trump is going to do? I think right now we are going through incredibly evil times. I mean, Trump, I talk about in my video how the Nazis were inspired by the treatment of brown people in the United States. So Hitler, when the act of 1924, the U.S. immigration law was passed, he praised it. He said, this is a wonderful law, and I include that in my book, because it has to do with eugenics, it has to do with racial purity. You want to keep certain inferior racial people out. He used to write fan mail to Madison Grant, who wrote that Mexicans should be deported back in 1916, when it wasn't even illegal. There were no such things as passports for Mexicans. And they were already calling for the deportation of Mexicans, whether they were born here or not, because of their genetic inferiority. So my mother, remember I told you that my mother would criticize my father for being a cheapskate. Well, only later, when I started doing this research, I realized that the Nazis were not only paying attention to the pesticides, Cyclone B. If that's how it had been, you would have said, well, okay, that's one case. Maybe it was a coincidence. They were paying attention to forced sterilization in California. Between 1907 and 1979, as late as the 70s, 40,000 women were forcibly sterilized in California. 60% of them were of Mexican descent, Mexican or Mexican American. And later I thought, was my mother one of them? You know, that. So my story becomes not only a personal story, it becomes a collective story. Fighting fascism and fighting these horrendous ideas of racial supremacy would take a long, long struggle. So when you're asking me, are we able to stop Trump? You know, hopefully people vote against him. But these ideas are like a sickness in the body politic of this country. They're part of its DNA. How do you heal a sick body? It takes a lot. I'm doing my little part. In Spanish, it's called cada quien su granito de arena. We do what we can. I'm very grateful to Patrick Rija because he went out and bought hundreds of books and he's spreading them. That's what I do. I play the flute and I write books. Everybody else does what they do. We all have to put our granito de arena. That's the only way to change.
Just to play devil's advocate.
Yeah. How much does the devil
because
pay
it
you
makes
to be
his advocate
your
not
advocate.
enough. So historically, under Republican administrations, we have seen better immigration laws, or we have seen actual immigration and laws enacted that have been helpful to immigrants. So I think that it's hard to make a blanket statement that either one party or another has ever offered any efficacious solutions. And I mean to say this because, again, I represent a diaspora of Latinos, and they vote all over the spectrum, and I don't think it's my business to get into their hearts and tell them who to vote for. My work is basically the person in front of me. I see Christ in them, and it is my aspiration to help you and to. So I don't get into who or what you want to vote for, but recognizing that no party has really offered a great solution to the problem of immigration. And the Catholic Church at least recognizes that every country has a right to protect their borders, and the Catholic Church holds intention that whilst we do that, we also have to acknowledge and revere the image of God that is in front of us in this human being. So again, I go back to the challenge of holding that tension. Do you think it is wise for us to kind of with a broad brush paint any one politician or political party, or is it most efficacious for people to kind of do their research and then make up their mind?
No, I definitely agree that we have to do our research. I definitely agree that this is a systemic problem. So when Obama was president, he built the largest sections of the wall than Trump.
To call him deporter-in-chief.
Yeah, the deporter-in-chief. To me, the powers of colonization have always played good cop, bad cop. And they always force you to choose the lesser of two evils. That's how I understand colonization. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church served as the good cop for the bad cop of the sword, right? And so the Catholic Church, and I give tours under the Jesuit umbrella, right? When people come to El Paso, like Patrick. So I work with the church in El Paso. And I have to, in Spanish se dice, no tengo pelos en la lengua. I have to speak the truth as I see it. The Catholic Church was part of cultural genocide, not only in places like Canada, right? And at the same time, the Catholic Church in the current situation has, especially like in places like El Paso, they've stood up to power. Right now I'm working with an Annunciation House, which the governor of Texas has called, human smugglers and all kinds of stuff. It was the Catholic Church, both white Catholics and Mexican Catholics, that stood up to the Ku Klux Klan in El Paso, right? So the Catholic Church has done some good things, but in terms of indigenous people, it did some terrible things. And I write about this, and I give it to my priest, Father, and they have to acknowledge the truth, because that's part of repairing history, right? There are reparations. So yes, it's systemic. So the Democrats are complicit.
I think it's the human condition, right? The complexity of the human condition, good and bad, because at the end of it, the Catholic Church is also comprised of people, broken people, wounded people, and broken, wounded people do broken, wounded things, as well as it's comprised of people who are heroic and do heroic things. Again, the Crucero Wars, where it was, Mexican Catholics who bore the brunt of what was happening there, and it was Mexican Catholics who also brought their country back to back to where it should be, back to a democracy after the communist rule. But we have a question here that we don't want to let go of.
I want to make a statement first. There's a priest that was here at our parish, St. Francis Xavier, who moved down to El Paso because of his passion. His name was Rafael Garcia.
Yes.
He's a wonderful, wonderful man, and he's doing great things down there, as well as Ruben Garcia. Mm-hmm. Ruben, who runs Annunciation House,
yes.
He came here to Kansas City and spoke at Rockhurst University. He's a brilliant guy. I mean, he's done wonderful things. That's my statement. My question, in your book, you wrote about some of my boyhood heroes and did not speak very well of them. It was enlightening to me, very enlightening. And I wish you would just raise a couple of those here, which might entice some of the people here to read your book, or just asking questions about other things that they learned as young people that are not true. So,
yes, you and I have already had this conversation. So tell the people who these heroes were and what was, I assume you're talking about the Texas creation myth. Do you want to tell how you learned about the Alamo and the creation of Texas when you were a kid?
I learned about some of what they did that I did not know as a boy because I read the book. I'm talking about Davy Crockett. I'm talking about the Alamo. I'm talking about other people who, you know, I was a little kid. I watched The Lone Ranger, and I watched Annie Oakley and all of that stuff. And they were different people in my mind. They were the heroes.
Yeah.
I used to go and pay 10 cents to go to the movie theater and watch the U.S. cavalry beat up on Native Americans. Stuff like that I found enlightening in your book, and I wish you would just share that with the audience.
So your perspective was Disney movies, John Wayne movies, yes, and the creation of the Alamo. And how can you, I mean, we're bombarded with that kind of propaganda, really. And what I write about it in my book is that that's the Texas creation myth, that somehow there were these bad Mexicans led by General Santana, an utterly corrupt Mexican president from the perspective of how this history is told, and there were these brutal Mexicans that killed these heroes that were fighting for independence and against, they would call the Catholics like superstitious, the Catholics in Mexico superstitious and backwards, and they just weren't very smart, and they were dirty, the criminal element, a lot of kind of the same stereotypes. Now, from what people haven't considered is that Mexico abolished slavery in 1829 when it had its first mixed ancestry Afro-Mexicano president, Vicente Guerrero. And so when Americans from the United States immigrated to Texas, they were very upset that Mexico did not allow them to legally bring in enslaved people. The reason later that slavery did not thrive on the U.S. Mexican border is because of Mexican solidarity with enslaved Africans. Everybody knows about the Underground Railroad that goes to the north, but thousands of escaped enslaved Africans went to Mexico with the aid of Mexicans, a lot of them Mexican Christians that would hide them in the churches, that would risk their lives and properties to do that. So Texas is the only state in the contemporary United States that seceded twice over the issue of slavery. And the first time they seceded against Mexico, from Mexico, their mother patria, and then the second time from the United States. So my perspective is very different, and it's probably going to be banned. It just came out a month ago. 4 or 5 months, I think I'm going to be in the illustrious list of banned books, and that's probably going to be one of the reasons it's banned.
Okay. Well, it was amazing. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I do want to remind you that the books are for sale. And for those of you who are teachers or students, there is a way for you to get those books for free, thanks to our friends at Heartland. So please be sure to follow up with Jody. I'm just going to point her right there, that lady right there, to see how you can get a free book. One last cute anecdote, if the folks who hold the power of the AV that I just found out about from one of my Mexican students. I teach catechism classes. Anyway, St. Patrick's is apparently a feast celebrated in some parts of Mexico, St. Patrick's Day. This Irish feast day, right? Like, why is it celebrated? Yeah. And it turns out that during the Mexican-American War, as Irish people were coming into the country as well, they were, impressed and pressed to go to war in the Mexican-American War. What they observed were the priests over the bodies of the fallen Mexican soldiers, giving them last rites, because Mexicans were Catholic, the priests were following the soldiers into the battle, and when the Catholic Irish saw that these Catholic priests were ministering to their Catholic Mexicans, they said, well, who are we fighting for? They dropped their arms and went on the Mexican side to fight with Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Yeah. And I thought to myself, gosh, that's a beautiful story of solidarity, right. A unity of the faith. And that is our complicated human story, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Romo. You'll be here for another 2 hours. No, I'm kidding.